I should state at the outset that I know less about artificial intelligence than anyone else in this room, and I wore the suit and tie just to prove that to all of you. Josh is a wannabe know nothing. The good news is that innovation doesn't depend on government officials like me or economists like me understanding what's going to happen in the future. Innovation only depends on us not thinking that we are going to understand what's happening in the future and leaving it all to you. I want to, though, apply, I think, some of the broader lessons and things we've learned from economics over the last decades, centuries, and even millennia to ask what they mean about what artificial intelligence might mean for our economy, and then a little bit about the policy implications of that as well, which we can discuss more with the panel. The biggest question, everyone has is, will the robots take all of our jobs? Of course, we all know robots and AI are different, and there's a lot of people scared. 2016 seems to be a big year for the fear of the robots eclipsing us, artificial intelligence eclipsing us, and taking all of our jobs. Of course, 1933 was also a big year for this fear, with Mr. Robot often outshines his master. 1981, terror about automation taking all of our jobs. 1960, etc. So we've been worrying about this for a long time. And so far, it hasn't happened. I think there's some good economic reasons why it hasn't happened, which is most of the jobs we have today, we didn't have 100 years ago, we didn't have 1,000 years ago. Most of the jobs we have then have since been replaced by machines, by automation. But those machines and automation also make us richer, and when we're richer, we want to buy more stuff, and buying more stuff creates other types of jobs. And those machines complement other types of skills, which also creates a set of jobs. That doesn't mean we don't have any worries associated with AI and the economy. I think we do, and I think it could have side effects in terms of inequality and labor force participation that I'll be talking about. But my first and biggest worry about artificial intelligence is that we simply don't have enough of it, and it's not making a big enough economic impact right now. Listening all morning, I'm considerably more optimistic about the future than I was even just a few hours ago. But if you look not forward, but you look at the last decade, we're not seeing it in the data. This gives us productivity growth from 1995 to 2005, and then from 2005 to 2015. If you look at the 31 economies that the IMF classifies as advanced, in 30 out of the 31 you see the same pattern of slowing productivity growth. In the United States, just because I don't get paid if I don't brag about the United States every day, we're number one in the G7. But we are very pleased that Canada is close on our heels in productivity growth over the last decade. But this isn't good enough for any of us. Now, some people look at these and think the government statisticians, this is just proof they don't know how to measure anything. And I think it's certainly the case that 1% productivity growth in the United States in the last decade, or that 0.8% productivity growth in Canada in the last decade, is lower than the reality. I think there's a lot of things the statisticians are missing. I also think, though, that 2.5% in the decade before was also missing a lot of things. And if you look at careful efforts to figure out how much is missing from each of those bars, it seems like it's about the same amount. It's even possible that more was missing in that previous decade when, for example, we got things like the World Wide Web, search, e-commerce, mobile phones, mobile email, as opposed to the last decade when we got Waze and Greek yogurt. Which I don't devalue. Those are two of my favorite things, and I think they are undermeasured in the economic data. But I think we've always been mismeasuring the data, so I don't think that gets us out of the problem. Something has resulted in slower productivity growth, and part of the disconnect between what you hear in a room like this and what some of our intuition thinks and some of what we measure is that most of the economy, most of GDP, just isn't as exciting as what everyone in here is talking about. Mobile phones are, I don't know what, they're like 0.00 whatever % of GDP. We all get really excited about Uber, but we spend 15 times as much on air travel as we spend on taxi, limousine, and Uber-like activities, and you haven't seen the same technological transformations there. Similarly, we spend more on education, health care, home building than we spend on our mobile phones. So a lot of what our economy does hasn't been affected in the same ways. I think it can be. I think maybe it will be. But to date, it hasn't. That's not to say that technology hasn't made contributions. I can't give you a bar chart showing you the growth of AI, so I'll give you one showing the growth in worldwide shipments of industrial robots. They've increased dramatically. They were responsible for probably 0.4 of a percentage point per year of GDP growth from the late 1990s on, a substantial fraction of the GDP growth we've had. The question is then, I talked about the general theory about why I don't think the robots, why I don't think the AI is going to take our jobs. And by the way, just to be clear, when I'm making all sorts of predictions, I'm going out as far as I could reasonably aspire to live, and I'm not assuming that we figure out immortality in my lifetime. Maybe at some point things will be radically different, and at that point we can have, like the robots, figure out the answer to these questions, and you won't need me talking about them. The question is part of the economics of why it's not going to replace jobs is complement for labor. That's a good story. Part is we're all richer and we're going to spend more. But part of why the robots won't take our jobs is that we can compete with them. And unfortunately, one of the dimensions we can compete with them is on wages. And that's part of what we've seen over the last 40 years, is we've seen technology that complements people with skills and tends to replace people with less skills. To quantify what this might mean going forward, there was a much-cited study by Frey and Osborne at Oxford that estimated that half of the jobs that exist today could be replaced by automation. At the Council of Economic Advisors, we went through their list of jobs that could be replaced by automation and coded them on the wages they paid, and in US dollars, apologies for that. And what we found was that the jobs that paid less than $20 an hour, 83% of them made their list of susceptible to automation. $20 to $40 an hour, it was 31%, and above $40 an hour, it was only 4%. Now, you can debate this set of numbers all you want. You can add and subtract 10, 20 percentage points to any of these bars, and you get a pretty stark conclusion, though, which is if you look who's going to face the competition from automation, it's people with less skills, it's people with lower wages, and that will continue to drive wage differentials in the same way we've seen those wage differentials driven over the last couple decades. And that's contributed, for example, to the rise in the share of income earned by the top 1%. Another thing I would note that the United States is #1 in, but I'm not sure I get a bonus for pointing that out. Canada is in the middle of the pack in this regard. One, and there's a lot of things that have gone into this inequality, but one of them have been the types of technological developments we've seen over the last couple decades. So part of our lack of concern about the robots taking all our jobs is that you might actually get more of this, and that's how people end up holding on to their jobs. Another lesson from this is inequality isn't technologically determined. You can't just look at our technology and decide what our level of inequality is, and that is also true of the labor force participation rate. And I'm showing you now the fraction of men between the age of 25 and 54 who are participating in the workforce, either in a job or looking for a job. And the first thing you note here is that there's just a big variation across countries. And if you look at Italy versus Switzerland, the difference isn't that Switzerland that Italy has lots of technology, lots of automation, and we've figured out how to replace lots of people's jobs, and Switzerland is just so backward they still need the humans to do the work. The difference really is labor market institutions' choices about how easy it is to hire people, how much assistance you give people searching for a job, and a set of other things. The second thing, which is a little harder to tell, is that those little diamonds are where the labor force participation rate was in 1990. The bars are where it is today. For the United States, you actually saw the largest, second largest of this group decline in the labor force participation rate for prime-age men. I'm not showing women. The pattern there is pretty similar. The line is pretty similar, but there's a whole bunch of other different factors at work in explaining that. You know, the differences you see here are about 10 percentage points. To put that in perspective, a recession is when your unemployment rate goes up by about 2 percentage points. So this is much larger than a recession, the differences across countries. It has nothing to do with technology, automation, anything in that regard. What it has to do with is a set of labor market institutions. It does intersect with them, though, because let's say half of our jobs disappeared due to automation. I have no doubt that that automation would make us rich and create more jobs, but some of the people that lost jobs wouldn't necessarily get back into new ones, or that may take them a while. And for whatever set of reasons, you know, some sets of labor market institutions help people get back on their feet and into new jobs and find the new opportunities more quickly than others do. You know, in summary, I would say that I think of artificial intelligence, I think of this as innovation, as a high problem. It's a problem we would like to have more of. We'll get more of it mostly because of people in this room. There's some things that we need to do in terms of public policy. We've been taking a hard look at that at the White House and have put out a couple of reports recently on it. Some of that is basic research where you won't necessarily have the incentive to do the type of long-range, abstract, uncommercializable things with large spillovers. The evidence is that we should maybe be doing 2 to 4 times as much of that relative to what we are now. Some of it is workforce development. You know, computers can beat someone in Go, but a human needed to program that computer, making sure we continue to have that pipeline. Some of it is making sure that our economy has sufficient competition and dynamism, which I think, as The Economist has documented and we have documented and others have, is actually declining, at least in the U.S. economy. Some is in privacy, so that people have the trust that they need and so that we can make data available to make advances while giving people the trust they need. And then cybersecurity, so that AI isn't some novel new threat to us, but also can help us solve that threat. So I think those are a lot of the steps we need to take on our end to help make sure that there's more AI. But at the same time, as I said, it is a high-class problem. And some of the side effects I don't think are something brand new that we've never seen before in terms of mass unemployment. But I think some of those side effects could be something we have seen before, we have seen in the last 40 or so years, and that's continued pressure on inequality, continued pressure on the labor force participation rate. I don't think that requires some brand new remedy. I think that requires using some of the tools that we already know about, whether it's the minimum wage and more progressive tax policy, education, and other changes to help people find jobs in labor markets. Not certain about any of this. I think it's really exciting and important area, and look forward to our discussion.
Here we go. Thanks, Jason. And next I'd like to introduce Josh Gans. He is a professor of strategic management, and he's the Jeff School Chair of Technological Innovation and Entrepreneurship here at the Robin School of Management. He's also the chief economist of the Creative Destruction Lab.
Thanks very much. It's great to be talking again. Those of you last year who remember my talk I'm unlike Jason here. I'm an economic theorist. I think about things at an abstract level. Last year we talked about are the machines going to destroy humanity? And I, as an economist, was able to tell you that we've been thinking about superintelligences for many years. People say it's a bug of economics. In this case, it's a feature. And I can tell you the laws of economics will still hold and we will be fine. So now we're coming back with a shorter time horizon and just thinking about the impacts of the growth in AI, automation and other things on employment. And I want to give you a perspective as how economists think about that. And so I have this title here, Trade with Robotlandia, which illustrates pretty much entirely how an economist would approach this problem. And so just to give you a sense of why this is an issue, these two figures, this is Eric Brynjolfsson and Bob Gordon. They're currently locked in a debate about the future of the economy. Eric Brynjolfsson is an optimist regarding innovation, and Bob Gordon basically says, done. Bob Gordon says, we peaked with the toilet. Eric Brynjolfsson says, actually the mobile phone was pretty good, just ask young people, they'd happily give up the toilet first. So it's just a substitution in crap from toilet to Snapchat, I guess. Anyway, nonetheless, what's interesting about both, they've both written very successful books, and they both have an interesting conclusion. Eric Brynjolfsson said the robots are coming, so we need education to avoid dislocation of all the workers. Bob Gordon says innovation is dead, and we need education to avoid dislocation of the workers. So we have two completely different projections on the economy, both reaching the same conclusion: we need more education. Now, I'm sitting here in a university, I'm supposed to support that, but we should be suspicious when we see those sorts of statements in support of that sort of goal.
Yeah, from professors.
From professors as well, exactly. Well, nonetheless. But people always throw in education, and I think it's a bit more subtle than that. So let me give you an idea. So we have different sorts of people. Some people are more have people skills, emotional skills and other things. Others are more analytical. We can cut people up different ways, but I think this is something that's come up in these discussions. Those people currently produce stuff. That's great. Wonderful. Now, what happens when we have something new? And the way we think about it as a metaphor is, imagine there is this mythical island of Robotlandia that gets discovered, and it's inhabited by adorable little robots, and they're now able to trade with the rest of the economy. Okay? What is the impact of it on those people in the economy currently? So we know a lot about that. We know a lot about international trade. And so you think, once I say that, well, I'm an economist, everything's free trade, it's all got good, don't worry. However, we actually know a little bit more about that, and it's a bit subtle in its distributional impacts. So what trade does is it makes scarce inputs less scarce. So we have to think first, what is the scarce input that is being made less scarce by robots? A reasonable hypothesis would be it was the analytical people rather than the people who interact with other humans that were going to get challenged by this. And so what does that mean? That means the income of these inputs are going to fall. That's what we've been talking about. But actually it is well-known economic theorem that they will actually fall faster than the prices, because trade with robots brings down the price of goods. But it turns out that the wages of the input that's being displaced actually fall quicker. So there is a concern there. And so the incomes of the other inputs, though, rise. And that was discussion of compliments there. In fact, we could up the emoticon there on those people from that effect. But if it turns out that when the analytical people are no longer getting as higher income, they don't learn, young people don't study and become more analytical, well, eventually that might actually bite back, and it may lose this incentives to replenish these inputs, and so everybody might be unhappy. And that's the scenario we worry about. It's a theoretical possibility. What can we do about it? So what is education a solution to this is one issue. Well, education works if we're very free to choose a new skill set. In other words, we can move people around and we can retrain them very easily. But this is not going to happen in certain circumstances. First of all, it's not going to happen if some people aren't suited to some skills. If you can't make the analytical people do what the people were doing, you're going to have a problem if there's some innate characteristics. Secondly, we might actually lose knowledge of skills altogether. Okay? So when we get self-driving cars, people won't drive, and if people don't drive or have never driven, they won't be able to drive. Now, that means that essentially that goes out the window, and there's a sense in which we might have to give some thought to how that knowledge gets preserved. Because one of the fundamental tenets of free trade and of being good for everybody is that it must be good for everybody because we can always go back to what we had before. But if we lose the ability to do that, that cannot happen. And there's a final bit where there's an interesting effect going, in a sense that this time it is different. And why is this important for AI? It's important for AI, and we've already heard about this. Machine learning is now about experience. Okay? If we take this, certainly the view of Geordie Rose and his folks at Kindred, they are literally training the AI based on experience of doing stuff, doing activities. Okay? So what does that mean? So in developing AI, you'll be replacing the experience of humans. Humans won't need to have those experiences and may not even have access to it because you'll be paying for the robots to have those experiences. So that means there's a new dimension upon which humans can be substituted and a new input that we think might be scarce that we've never thought about before. And that is experience. Experience itself might be the scarce input. And what we're getting as we move AI into a lot of fields is a lot of people are no longer getting those experiences, and thinking about how those trade-offs occur and what we lose and gain from that is going to be a challenge for all of us.
Great, thanks. And now I'm going to introduce Matthew Bishop, and he's going to introduce the rest of the panel. Matthew is a senior editor at The Economist Group. He's author of several books, including Philanthrocapitalism, How Giving Can Save the World, The Road from Ruin, and more recently, Economics, an A to Z guide. And more personally, he was also the author of the very first article about my last company, Ripple, which was a huge impact on our business, so thank you very much for that. Take it away.
Thank you very much. And Jason mentioned a number of times that America is still number one, and for those of you who read The Economist, tomorrow's cover is entitled Liberty Heads North, with a picture of a smiling moose. And so it's all a paean of praise to Canada. Anyway, so I wanted to pick up on some of the comments and ask the two remaining panelists first their views on this. One is Pedro Domingo of the University of Washington, who's written The Master Algorithm, which I think is a fantastic book on AI and all the changes going on at the moment. And to his right is Michael Chui of the McKinsey Global Institute, and again, an author of many very influential pieces on this topic. Now, it seems to me that, generally across the economics profession, I think this was reflected in your comments, Jason, there are two broad thoughts that always come up. One is that in the long run, jobs get destroyed, by technology, new jobs come along. And, we went from being essentially an agrarian economy to being a manufacturing economy to being a service economy, and we'll now go to being whatever the next post-service or whatever economy it's going to be. And that over time, all this fear of jobs being destroyed and the fear that we won't come up with new jobs is a kind of Luddite view that is not borne out by the facts. And the other is this puzzle going back beyond Robert Gordon to people like Robert Solow that say all these innovative technologies we adopt don't seem to actually improve our productivity. And this seems to be a puzzle. And those two themes have come up again. And I guess the question, I'll start with you, Pedro. I mean, in your longer paper, Jason, that goes with your talk, you talk about how the short term, it might be different. The adjustment period might be different this time. And that the short term could be many decades, which is, almost getting into the Keynesian definition of the long term when we're all going to be dead. I wanted to ask you, Pedro, do you think that there's something about the scalability of AI, this notion of exponential change that we hear all the time in Silicon Valley, that means that the destruction process of jobs may happen in a Schumpeterian way that really wipes out things, jobs in a massively fast way, and so it will actually take us much longer to get out of that short-term disruption, and thus we do need different policy responses.
Yeah, actually, what I think is somewhat the opposite. I hate to disappoint all the fans of exponential technologies out there, but the truth is that there is no such thing as an exponential technology. Exponentials do not exist in the real world because, things can't keep growing forever, let alone faster and faster. What every curve of technological progress looks like is what's called an S-curve. An S-curve is something that starts out flat, and then it starts to pick up, and then it has a phase where it's changing very rapidly, and then it stabilizes again. The first part of an S-curve is mathematically indistinguishable from an exponential. So we often have the illusion that we're in an exponential period of change, but then things flatten out. So what I think what's happening with jobs is that we are actually seeing that S-curve. And in fact, the curve that you were showing, the way I interpret it is that the US is actually farther along that you actually see the S-curve when you look at country by country in labor force participation. What's going to happen, this is what's been happening, is that the unemployment or the labor force participation, it's starting to creep up. And it's going to keep creeping up somewhat faster and faster. In the short term, I don't think AI is going to create a huge unemployment problem. But then there's going to come an inflection point at which suddenly we do get to this, machines are better than people doing most things, and I think at that point things will change very fast. And then we will get to a point where actually what we're measuring is not the unemployment rate anymore, it's the employment rate. And we'll be saying things like, the US is behind because our employment rate is still 5%, and in China it's already only 1%. Those poor, Americans still have to work so much, and the Chinese already work less.
So you think there's absolutely nothing to worry about?
No, on the contrary. So, thanks for bringing it back to that point. I actually think that there are different sets of things to worry about in the short and the long term. I think in the short term, the two things to worry about are some jobs will disappear. So, truck drivers should be worried. I think, automated trucks are coming along faster than people think, partly because the rest of the environment is going to adapt. I mean, just to give the example of self-driving cars, most people don't know that there were self-driving cars driving across America 20 years ago. Long before the DARPA Grand Challenge, there was this project at CMU called Alvin, and they managed to almost drive coast to coast with no hands. This was 20 years ago. And 15 years ago, there was a project in California where they automated part of the highway. And this didn't take AI. It just took, sensors in the cars and markers in the lane. So we can make all of that happen fairly quickly. So there are some jobs that people need to be worried about. And we need to worry about, what's going to happen with those people. But the bigger thing in the short term is most of our jobs aren't going to disappear, but they are going to be changed by AI. Every one of us needs to be thinking about how AI is going to change our job. The best way to keep your job safe from automation is to automate it yourself. Make sure, figure out how you can automate and, how it is that you complement what the machines do. This, I think, is the short-term picture. The longer-term picture is we will, I think, come to a point where most people, it's not that they just don't have jobs, it's that they don't have to work. Right? And then we will need to figure out how organize society and motivate people and so on in very different ways than what we have today. I think people in some ways are trying to judge that future in a way that is by their old frame of mind, but they also seem to think that their future is closer than it really is.
Michael, I just want to pick up on some of those points. I mean, do you agree, firstly, that there is unlikely to be this Schumpeterian wave of creative destruction? I mean, I think I'm slightly nervous about it. I mean, certainly, if you look at the way Uber has wiped out traditional taxi services in a number of places, you apply its acquisition of Otto, and suddenly you can imagine a switch being pulled, and every truck driver in the world could be basically superfluous at that point, and that is hundreds of millions of jobs. So do you share that view that there's nothing to worry about?
I'm still a fan of Schumpeter. So I don't think creative destruction goes away. Unfortunately, the lab will still be here. But I do think, as we've been trying to understand what the potential timeframes are for some of these technologies being developed, integrated, solutions created, and adopted, I think we're coming to a point of view where in micro it might happen faster than you think or want it to. If you're an individual truck driver and your company decides we're going to deploy the stuff that the auto team is putting together, that can be very challenging for you. But when we look at how long it will actually take to adapt and adopt all of these technologies, we're modeling out into the decades. We're talking about several generations of work. And so I think, if you look at how long it will take significant percentages of activities, and by the way, we think the right level of granularity for looking at these is not jobs or not occupations, but individual activities, Pedro, as you were mentioning, because we think it's very unlikely that for an entire role you'll be able to automate, replace everything that one person does with AI, et cetera. But when you look at the level of activities, we do think it will take several decades for many of these technologies to actually come into play. But I want to come back to a place that Jason was, which is what the impact of these technologies might be or need to be for productivity. If you look at economic growth in the biggest in the world, G19 plus Nigeria, for the past 50 years, I think it's been about 3.5% annually. And about half of that has come from labor force growth. So population increases, more women in the workforce, et cetera, and about half of that from productivity growth. Well, what's going to happen to labor force growth, particularly here in Canada? It's going to disappear in the next 50 years, roughly. I think, well, hopefully there'll be more immigration. Basically, we're going to lose half of the sources of our economic growth. And that means our kids don't have as good lives as we do. And by the way, as Jason pointed out, if I'm right, for the past 2 quarters in the U.S., productivity growth has been negative, I think, right? Sorry, that's not something you'll get a bonus for either. But
it's because there are more people working.
You could say. That is scary, right? So the 2 sources of our economic growth in the world, one of them is disappearing for sure, because demographics, and the other one is up for grabs. And instead of worrying about AI being a driver of mass unemployment, it might be the thing that saves us in terms of accelerating productivity so we actually continue to grow the economy, measurement issues notwithstanding.
So Jason, tell us a bit about this productivity challenge, and are there lessons from why we haven't had this productivity growth coming out of technology in the past that we can apply to AI now?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer. Let me just pick up a little bit of the employment we've been hearing and then segue to that. I think one thing that's really important to understand is last month, for example, in the United States, we created 150,000 jobs in net. The actual truth is we created about 2.5 million jobs, and we lost about 2.35 million jobs. Massive numbers of jobs created every month, massive numbers of jobs lost every month, huge amounts of creative destruction going on all the time. These gross flows are much larger than the net flows. So, absent an invention that renders half of jobs non-existent overnight, I think anything we have could increase that tempo a little bit. If it increased that tempo a little bit, I think with the right labor market institutions, we could handle it. I think we in the United States, at least right now, don't have the right labor market institutions, so I'm not sure we could handle it quite as well. But again, just I don't think we're further along the S-curve on this. Our non-participators are mostly people with a high school degree or less who aren't particularly well off. They're not founders of companies who sold it and are relaxing, because most of those people seem to be pretty restless no matter how much money they have, because people like working and get a lot of dignity from it, and it's an important thing to them. In terms of what we have, I think the optimistic story would be an S-curve type of story. You saw with electricity, there was a period before we knew how to deploy it, before we knew factories could be spread out and wide, before we changed even our urban architecture, had power stations, all of that. This period was slow productivity growth, then a burst of fast, and then it slowed again. Same thing with computers. Solow, who you quoted, said that in 1987. Took about another 8 years, but then we saw really rapid productivity growth as a result of computers. So I think the optimistic story is that we're figuring out one use here, one use there, one use there, and then each one of those will double and double again, and then you get at least a temporary exponential, if not a permanent exponential.
I think because Moore's law has been
Right.
exponential growth for quite a while,
Right.
hasn't it? Wouldn't
The question is
some
what
of
you're
those things.
buying with that doubling. I mean, my computer now is much faster than my computer a decade ago. It's, I don't know, thousands of times faster. I'm not doing thousands of times better word processing than I was a decade ago.
So, on this public policy angle, I mean, what do you think government should do, if anything?
I talked briefly about some of the things we should do, just to be provocative with the third of you that loves universal basic income. That's what I think we shouldn't do. I think we shouldn't do it, one, because the premise is wrong. I don't think we're all going to lose our jobs and need something to do without our jobs. I think our focus should be on work. That's completely possible. It's completely important for people. And it's also really hard to design a social safety net that gives large amounts of money to people for not working without ending up getting a lot more non-work, a century before the technology is there to support it. So I think it's the wrong diagnosis. I also think in a world where we have budget constraints, which certainly in the United States, the limited appetite for raising revenue, there's a lot higher claims on that revenue, whether it's education, infrastructure, low-income programs, and the like that have proven successes. So I think that's been a little bit of a distraction, this idea that something brand new is happening in the economy needs a brand new solution. I think we do need some good solutions, but I think that's the wrong premise and not the best use of money.
Can I quickly add something to that? Actually, it's good to have people disagree on the panel, right? And let me diametrically disagree with you. I think a basic income is a fantastic idea, not because of AI. I think the objections that you just raised to basic income are actually, every one of them is wrong, right? The idea, for example, that, and everyone can make up their own minds, but basic income is a good idea because we already have it. In developed countries, we don't let people starve or go without emergency care. We give them unemployment benefits, we give them this and this and Medicare, etc., etc. So basic income already exists. The reason to introduce basic income is to rationalize this patchwork of things, make it fair, make it more efficient, make it less bureaucratized, etc., etc. So this is one thing. The next thing is that, it would cost enormous amounts of money. It won't. We can set, basic income is a form of this redistribution. We can set it at whatever level we want, and we can make people pay for it and receive it in whatever way we want. So we can have a basic income that is revenue neutral. And finally, there's the objection that, then people won't want to work. Well, any form of income to the needy is a disincentive from work. Medicare, unemployment benefits, food stamps are a disincentive from work. That's no reason to not have them. That's reason to calibrate them. So I think, if you look at these factors, maybe basic income is a good idea. And I haven't said anything about AI yet.
Yeah, briefly, Jason, on the distribution.
I'll just be super fast. I mean, one is, I think it makes a little bit of a mockery of the term universal basic income unless you think most everyone is getting it. And I don't think we can afford to take people who are currently working, making $75,000 a year, and give them an income. If what you mean is we're doing the types of tax and transfer programs that we do now that are targeted as opposed to universal, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you look at the last couple decades in the United States, we've radically transformed our way of providing public assistance. And actually what we do now is we give you money primarily for working as a supplement for working. The Earned Income Tax Credit, you earn $1, we match 40 cents. You get to take home $1.40 for your work. That direction, I think, has by and large been more economically successful than the idea of a negative income tax, which goes.
The EITC is a bigger disincentive to work than a basic income. And just to clarify what I mean,
let's not have a long discussion about tax policy. Can we? I mean, I think the compelling appeal of a basic income is a world where most people, don't have jobs. I think in the environment we're in at the moment, it's very different. But I wanted to ask Joshua, this scenario that you have of experience needing to be, the risk that experience gets lost. I'm sort of struggling to imagine a world in which that happens, short of an apocalypse where we no longer have electricity or something of that kind. I mean, certainly, I mean, if the computer, if the singularity absorbs the past experience of driving, we're unlikely to lose. There's unlikely to be a scenario where we need to go back to traditional driving, is there, if this new technology works?
Well, it's unclear. What it means is that if you lose the skill from driving, your children do not have the opportunity to bargain with the world if they don't like how it's coming in and break from it. And so there's a thesis going back in history that this is actually what happened with hunting and gathering, which is something that takes decades to learn, not 6 months. And so, as an economist, we can't actually prove that everybody in the world has been better off from everything that has occurred for the last 5,000 years. So that's part of the issue. But I think there's actually a critical part to this. Jason put up that study which showed that most of the jobs at risk from automation were low-wage jobs. That should strike us as very surprising in this room, and we were just in 2 days of looking at startups in this space. There is no one looking to save the money of work that's already dirt cheap. All the people here are looking to save the money of people who are currently quite expensive. We had a number of ventures looking at lawyers. We have a number of ventures looking at diagnosticians to do with medical services and those sorts of things. Those are currently on the higher paying part of the job area. And that sort of changes how we think about all of this in terms of basic income and things in terms of its feasibility here. The jobs that half of this room is talking about are not the same jobs as the ones that are being talked about in the media. And we just haven't worked out what a dislocation along those lines would do.
Michael, do you have a reaction to that? It's interesting, this education idea. Every economist agrees education is a good thing, but I was recently at a parents' evening where they were pitching, a school in New York was pitching us on coming to their preschool on the basis that they would teach Mandarin and coding to my 3-year-old. And I came out and somebody said, well, actually, you're going to have an implant in your ear that will simultaneously translate everything by the time he graduates, and you won't need to code. Better to learn how to act and do English literature and so forth and have the creativity to thrive in the new world. So what sort of education do we actually need to be able to adapt to the kind of disruption that may come into the professional jobs?
I don't know. No. I mean, in the short to medium term, I think it's clear that understanding data better, understanding the types of technologies we're talking about here, for the people who can do it, will result in good outcomes for them, I think. And to Josh's point, I think it is remarkable, and what we find remarkable is the degree to which these technologies can affect high wage, high skill, and not just low wage, low skill. That being said, it's price times volume, right? So you get fewer people doing that. But I think we are starting to see the ability of these technologies to look at that, different segments of the market than we typically do when we think about where can we apply automation. I think the other thing that's just worth thinking about a little bit when it comes to automation is a set of meta skills, right? So because things are moving, and whether or not they're exponential, it's those things like grit, those things like resilience, flexibility, et cetera, which I think more than anything else will be important going forward, certainly in the medium to longer term versus in the shorter to medium term.
So I just want to, as time's almost up, I want to go just straight down the line with a very, very brief answer to these two questions. In the next 10 years, will the adoption of AI increase, or will it increase the productivity growth in the economy, and will it lead to more jobs being lost than are created? I'll start with you, Michael.
It will increase productivity, and I don't know whether or not it will destroy more jobs than create.
Pedro.
I think it will increase productivity, but it will fantastically increase the productivity of 10% of the people and decrease the productivity of 90% of the others.
So it will increase inequality as well, will it?
Yeah, but there's nothing wrong with an increase in inequality as long as the rising tide is lifting all boats.
Joshua.
I think it's increase on both fronts. I think there's reason to be optimistic that the initial applications of AI implement what people do.
And Jason, without your government hat on?
I think we will have faster productivity growth, and it will be net 0 for jobs, which is just fine because we'll have enough jobs with or without it.
Well, we shall see. Great. I'd like to thank the panel for being very provocative and interesting. Thank you.